The winter wind carried the smell of death. It came through the cracks in the timber walls of the Hayes homestead. A February wind that turned a man's breath to ice and made the strongest doubt whether spring would ever return to Wyoming territory. Inside the small bedroom, Robert Hayes lay dying. His breath came in shallow gasps. Each exhale took longer than the one before. 4 children stood around the bed. They had come from their separate claims and homes summoned by the doctor's message 3 days prior. The old man would not last the week, perhaps not the night. Silas Hayes stood at the foot of the bed, arms crossed, face impassive. At 32, he carried himself like a man who had already inherited everything that mattered. His coat was new wool, expensive. His boots were polished despite the mud outside. He checked his pocket watch twice in 10 minutes, the gold chain glinting in the lamplight. Adelaide Hayes Porter, 30 years old and wife to Jonathan Porter. The town's lawyer stood to the left, wrapped in a shawl of fine fabric. Her face held an expression of practiced sympathy, the kind of look a woman learns when attending social functions where appearing concerned matters more than actually caring. She dabbed at her eyes with a handkerchief, though no tears fell. Nathaniel Hayes, the youngest at 20, shifted his weight from foot to foot near the door. He watched his older siblings more than he watched his father. Always watching. Always waiting to see which way the wind blew before choosing his own direction. And Eleanor Hayes, 25 years old, sat in the chair beside the bed. Her hand rested on her father's weathered palm. She had been there for 3 days without leaving. Henrik Larsson, the German blacksmith from town, had brought her food twice a day. She barely touched it. Her dress was simple, homespun, worn at the elbows. Her hair, the color of autumn wheat, was pulled back in a practical braid. She was the only one who leaned close enough to hear her father's labored breathing. Robert Hayes opened his eyes. The blue had faded to something pale and distant, like winter sky through fog. His gaze moved across each of his children's faces, lingering longest on Eleanor. "The lawyer," he whispered. "Call him." Silas nodded to Nathaniel, who left the room quickly, grateful for an excuse to escape. The silence that followed pressed down like the weight of the snow outside. Adelaide coughed delicately. Silas checked his watch again. Eleanor squeezed her father's hand gently. 20 minutes later, Nathaniel returned with Mr. Tobias Crane, a thin man in a dark suit who carried papers in the air of someone who had seen too many deathbed scenes. He set his leather case on the small table, extracted a document, and cleared his throat. "The last will and testament of Robert Hayes." He began, his voice carrying the practiced monotone of legal proceedings. "Being of sound mind and body though infirm." "Get to the division," Silas interrupted. "We know the formalities." Mr. Crane's mouth tightened, but he nodded. He adjusted his spectacles and continued. "To my eldest son, Silas Hayes, I bequeath the eastern section of my land claim bordering the railroad survey line, comprising approximately 160 acres of grassland suitable for wheat cultivation." Silas's expression didn't change, but his shoulders relaxed slightly. The railroad land, the valuable claim, worth money, worth a future. "To my daughter, Adelaide Hayes Porter, I bequeath my savings held in silver dollars at the Territorial Bank of Cheyenne, totaling $240. Adelaide's hand went to her throat. $240. A fortune for a frontier woman. Enough to ensure comfort, security, respectability. To my youngest son, Nathaniel Hayes, I bequeath my livestock, including 2 horses, 1 wagon, 6 head of cattle, and all associated tack and equipment. Nathaniel blinked. A working start. Horses and cattle meant he could begin his own claim, his own life, without starting from nothing. The room waited. Mr. Crane turned to the final page. His eyes flicked to Eleanor, then back to the document. To my daughter, Eleanor Hayes, I bequeath the Western Ravine claim, including all land mineral rights and geological features therein, specifically including the cave, marked on territorial survey maps as worthless stone formation, together with thus accompanying map and journal. Silence. Then Silas laughed. Not a chuckle. A full, genuine laugh that echoed off the timber walls. A cave, he said. A worthless hole in the ground. Adelaide's practiced sympathy vanished, replaced by something that might have been pity or might have been contempt. It was hard to tell the difference. Father, she said softly, touching Eleanor's shoulder with false gentleness. Eleanor, you should know that claim has been surveyed 3 times. The territorial office marked it as having no value. The ravine is too steep for grazing. The soil is rocky. And the cave, she paused delicately. The cave is nothing but empty stone. You understand what this means, don't you? He's left you nothing. Nathaniel said nothing, but his face showed relief that he hadn't received the cave himself. Mr. Crane set down the papers and withdrew a sealed leather folder from his case. He handed it to Eleanor. Your father asked me to give you this directly, he said quietly. He was quite insistent. Eleanor took the folder. Inside was a hand-drawn map on worn paper folded many times. The creases were soft with age and handling. Beside it, a small leather-bound journal, its pages yellowed and filled with her father's cramped handwriting. Robert Hayes's hand tightened on Eleanor's. His voice, when he spoke, was barely a whisper. She had to lean down her ear inches from his lips to hear him. The earth keeps its warmth for those patient enough to find it. His eyes held hers. In that moment, despite the failing body and the shallow breath, there was nothing confused or unclear in his gaze. This was a man who knew exactly what he was doing, exactly what he was saying. You were always the one who listened, he whispered. The only one. Then his hand went slack. Dr. Augustus Morrison, who had been standing quietly in the corner, stepped forward. He checked for a pulse, listened for breath. After a long moment, he straightened and shook his head. He's gone. Adelaide wept. The tears came freely now, real or performed, it hardly mattered. Nathaniel looked at the floor. Silas removed his hat and held it to his chest in the proper gesture of mourning. Eleanor sat motionless, her father's hand still in hers, the leather folder in her lap. The funeral was held 3 days later. The ground was too frozen to dig a proper grave, so Robert Hayes was laid to rest in the small cemetery on a hill overlooking the valley. Rocks were piled over the coffin until spring came and proper burial could be completed. 17 people attended. Most were neighbors who had known Robert for 20 years. A few were townspeople who came out of respect for the dead, not affection for the man. Henrik Larsson stood at the back, his broad shoulders blocking the wind for the smaller mourners. He watched Eleanor throughout the service. She stood alone apart from her siblings. She did not cry. After the last prayer, after the neighbors had offered their condolences and departed, after Adelaide and Silas and Nathaniel had returned to town, in Nathaniel's wagon Eleanor remained. She stood before the pile of rocks that marked her father's resting place, the wind pulling at her black mourning dress. Henrik approached slowly. His boots crunched on the frozen ground. "Miss Eleanor," he said. His accent still carried the rhythms of his native Germany, though he had been in America for 23 years. "You should not stand in this cold too long." "He gave me a map," Eleanor said. She didn't look at Henrik. Her eyes remained on the grave. "And a journal. My brother and sister think he gave me nothing." "Your father was many things," Henrik said carefully. Confused was not one of them. Eleanor turned to face him. Her eyes were dry but red-rimmed from wind and lack of sleep. "You knew him well." "Better than most. He helped me when I first came to this territory. When my wife died, he sat with me through the dark times. He was a good man, a patient man, a man who saw things others missed." Eleanor reached into her coat and withdrew the folded map. She opened it carefully, protecting it from the wind. The paper showed the western section of her father's claim, the ravine marked with careful detail, and at the bottom a small cave entrance drawn with precise measurements. "Did he ever speak to you about this cave?" Henrik was quiet for a long moment. Then he nodded. "Once, maybe 5 years ago, he took me there. Showed me something I would not have believed if I had not seen it with my own eyes." "What did you see?" "Water," Henrik said. "Warm water rising from deep in the earth. Your father, he put his hand in it and smiled like a man who had discovered gold. But he made me promise never to speak of it. He said it was for later, for the right time, for the right person." Eleanor looked down at the map again. Her father's handwriting marked temperatures, measurements, observations. This was not the random scrawling of a confused mind. This was methodical, scientific. This was the work of a man who understood exactly what he had found. "He gave it to me," she said softly. "Yes. Not Silas, not Adelaide, not Nathaniel. No." "Why?" Henrik smiled a sad expression that carried weight. "Because you are the one who would believe him." The wind picked up, carrying ice crystals that stung like thrown sand. Eleanor folded the map carefully and returned it to her coat. "Thank you, Mr. Larson." "Henrik," he corrected gently. "Your father called me Henrik. You should too." She nodded. Then she turned and walked down the hill toward the small cottage she had been renting in town. Henrik watched her go, then looked back at the pile of rocks. "You chose well, old friend," he said to the grave. "I hope she knows what you have given her." March came with false promises of spring. The snow began to melt in the afternoons, then froze again each night, creating a landscape of ice and treacherous footing. Eleanor spent the first 2 weeks of the month in her cottage, studying the map and journal her father had left her. The journal was extraordinary. Page after page of careful observations spanning 20 years. Temperature readings taken at different times of day and different seasons. Soil samples described in detail. Measurements of the cave's dimensions. Notes on airflow and ventilation. Sketches of rock formations and water patterns. And plants. Her father had tested plants in the cave. Small experiments, a few seeds here and there. Careful documentation of what grew and what failed. Moss, ferns. In the later years, more ambitious attempts. potato eyes planted in the warm soil near the water, turnip seeds, greens. The results were documented with scientific precision. Potatoes sprouted in 8 days, far faster than surface planting, grew to maturity in 11 weeks, yield 6 potatoes from one eye, each firm and healthy. Turnips germinated in 4 days, mature in 7 weeks, sweet, crisp, no frost damage. Kale thrived in low light conditions, continuous harvest possible with warm soil temperature maintained. Eleanor read the entries over and over. Her father had not been wandering in delusion. He had been conducting careful, methodical experiments. For 5 years, he had been proving that the cave could sustain growth, that the geothermal warmth could create a pocket of life in the harshest Wyoming winter, and he had told no one. Not Silas, who would have tried to profit from it immediately. Not Adelaide, who would have seen it as something to sell or trade. Not Nathaniel, who would have told everyone in town by sunset. He had kept it secret. He had protected it. And then he had given it to Eleanor. On March 15th, Eleanor packed a rucksack with supplies, a lamp and oil, rope, a small shovel, dried food for 3 days, a canteen, the map and journal. She dressed in practical clothing, heavy wool trousers that had belonged to her father, Boots. She had resoled herself a thick coat with deep pockets. At dawn, she left town on foot. The walk to the western ravine was 8 miles over rough terrain. She had made the journey once before, years ago, when her father had taken all 4 children to see the extent of his claim. Silas and Adelaide had complained the entire way. Nathaniel had been too young to remember. Eleanor had walked quietly beside her father, listening to him point out landmarks, animal tracks, the shape of the land. She remembered. The scrublands stretched out in waves of brown and gray. Sagebrush clung to the rocky soil. In the distance, the mountains rose like jagged teeth against the pale sky. The wind was constant, pulling at her coat, carrying the smell of pine and cold stone. After 3 hours of walking, the land began to change. The flat scrubland gave way to rolling hills, then to steeper terrain. The ravine appeared suddenly a deep cut in the earth, where centuries of runoff had carved through layers of rock and sediment. Eleanor stood at the edge, looking down. The path was steep, treacherous. Loose stones covered the narrow trail that switched back down the ravine wall. One misstep would mean a fall of 30 feet onto jagged rocks below. She checked the rope in her pack, tested her footing, and began to descend. The world changed as she went down. The wind faded to a whisper. The temperature somehow felt warmer, though that should have been impossible. The sound of her boots on stone echoed off the ravine walls. 15 minutes of careful climbing brought her to a narrow wash at the bottom. Water had cut this channel over thousands of years, smooth stone under her feet. Now the walls rising 30 feet on either side. She followed the wash north, counting her steps as her father's map instructed. 240 paces. On the left wall of the ravine, set back from the wash and elevated about 6 feet above the stream bed, was the cave entrance. It was not large, perhaps 5 feet high, 4 feet wide. Dark stone framed it, and the darkness inside was absolute. But even from 10 feet away, Eleanor could feel it. Warmth. Not heat, but warmth. A subtle difference in the air temperature that made no sense in March in Wyoming territory. She lit her lamp, adjusted the flame, and approached the entrance. The cave mouth opened before her like a passage into the earth's secret heart. She had to duck slightly to enter, one hand holding the lamp high, the other touching the stone wall for balance. The passage ran straight for about 10 feet, then opened into a larger chamber. Eleanor stepped into the space and stopped. The lamplight caught mineral deposits on the walls, creating depths of blue and gray that shifted as she moved. The ceiling rose to perhaps 12 feet at its highest point. The chamber was roughly 30 feet across, irregular in shape, with smaller passages leading off into darkness on the far side. And there, in the center of the chamber, approximately 20 paces from where she stood, was the pool. Water perfectly clear, perfectly still. The surface reflected her lamplight like polished glass. Steam rose from it in gentle wisps, visible in the cool cave air. Eleanor approached slowly. She set the lamp down on a flat rock and knelt beside the pool. The water was warm, not hot enough to burn, but far warmer than any natural water should be in March. She could see the bottom clearly smooth stone maybe 4 feet down, with small channels and cracks where the water rose from deeper in the earth. Geothermal water, heated by the earth itself far below, rising through ancient fissures in the rock. The kind of geological phenomenon that occurred in only a few places in the territory. Her father had found one, and he had kept it secret. Eleanor withdrew her father's journal and opened to the temperature readings. He had documented the water at a constant 54 degrees year-round. The air in the cave maintained 48 to 52 degrees depending on the season, never freezing, never hot. A perfect constant warmth. She looked around the chamber with new eyes. Near the pool, darker patches marked the cave floor. Soil. Not stone, but actual soil. Rich, dark earth that had accumulated over time, washed in during floods, or carried by animals or deposited by wind. Her father's notes mentioned it. 6 inches deep in some places, a foot deep in others. And growing in that soil even now, even in this dim light, was life. Moss covered the rocks nearest the warm water, vibrant green despite the cave's darkness. Small ferns unfurled from crevices, their fronds reaching toward the faint light. Filtering through the entrance, lichen grew in patches of orange and white. This was not a dead cave. This was a sanctuary. Eleanor sat back on her heels and looked at the space with the eyes of someone seeing possibility instead of emptiness. The chamber was the size of a small barn. The ceiling was high enough for a person to stand comfortably. The air was cool but not cold, warm but not stifling. The water provided moisture and warmth both, and the soil protected from frost, never frozen, waited. Her father's words came back to her. The earth keeps its warmth for those patient enough to find it. She opened the journal to the section marked Crop Experiments, Year 5. The entries detailed careful plantings, small amounts testing viability. Her father had brought potato eyes down here in the fall, planted them in the warm soil near the pool, watered them with the geothermal water, watched them grow by lamplight through the winter months. Success. He had done the same with turnips, with kale, with onions. All had grown. All had thrived in this strange, warm darkness. Eleanor looked at the empty soil beds now. Her father's last plantings had been harvested before his illness. The soil waited ready, patient. A garden could grow here. Not just a few experimental plants, but a real garden. Vegetables that could sustain a person through the harshest winter. food when the world above was locked in ice and snow and death. Her father had proven it was possible, and he had given her the knowledge, the claim, the opportunity. The question was whether she had the faith to believe it. Eleanor spent the rest of that day exploring the cave's full extent. The main chamber where the pool lay was the largest, but smaller passages led to other spaces. One opened into a secondary chamber, smaller, maybe 15 feet across, with a natural shelf of rock that could serve as storage. Another passage led to a chimney-like opening in the ceiling, a natural ventilation shaft that would allow smoke to escape if she installed a stove. She documented everything in her own notebook, sketching rough maps, noting dimensions, thinking through logistics. To make this work, she would need supplies, seeds, a stove for heat and cooking, lamp oil in quantity, tools for working the soil, canvas for windbreaks, wood for shelving and frames, rope for climbing access, baskets for harvest. To make this work, she would need time, months of preparation, of planting, of tending in darkness and isolation. To make this work, she would need absolute commitment. Once she started, once she planted and invested her resources and effort, there would be no turning back. By the time Eleanor climbed out of the ravine, the sun was setting. The temperature had dropped 20 degrees in the last hour. Her breath came in clouds of white. But inside her chest, a warmth had settled that had nothing to do with the cave's geothermal water. She knew what she had to do. The walk back to town took longer in the dark. Eleanor navigated by moonlight and memory, her lamp oil saved for the cave work ahead. By the time she reached the cottage, it was past midnight. She lit a small fire, made weak tea, and sat at her table with her father's journal open before her. She began making lists: seeds needed, tools required, timeline for planting, calculations for how much oil she could afford, how long it would last, how to ration lamplight for both growing and living. She worked through the night. By dawn, she had a plan. It would take everything she had. Her small savings from years of working as a seamstress, the few possessions she could sell, every ounce of her strength, and every hour of the next 6 months. But it was possible. 2 days later, Eleanor walked to Henrik Larsson's blacksmith shop. The forge was already hot, and Henrik was working on a wagon wheel repair. He looked up when she entered, his face streaked with soot. "Miss Eleanor," he said, setting down his hammer, "what can I do for you? I need to ask you about my father's cave." Henrik wiped his hands on his leather apron and nodded. He stepped away from the forge and gestured to a bench near the back of the shop. "Sit. Ask." Eleanor sat, her hands folded in her lap. She had rehearsed this conversation a dozen times, but now that she was here, the words came differently than planned. "You said my father showed you the warm water." "Yes." "Did he tell you what he planned to do with it?" Henrik was quiet for a moment, his eyes on Eleanor's face, reading something there. "He said he was testing to see if things would grow. He said if it worked, if the cave could sustain life through winter, it would be a gift, a legacy. For me, for the child who would believe in it." Eleanor reached into her coat and withdrew her notebook, now filled with calculations and plans. She opened it to the first page and showed Henrik. "I'm going to build a garden in that cave. I'm going to plant vegetables that can grow through winter. And when the snows come, when the town is locked in ice, and people are eating dried stores, I'll have fresh food." Henrik looked at the notes. His expression didn't change, but his eyes moved carefully over her calculations, her sketches, her timeline. "This is ambitious," he said finally. "This is what my father wanted, what he prepared for. Your siblings will call you mad. They already think I'm a fool." Henrik closed the notebook and handed it back to her. Then he smiled a real smile that reached his eyes. "Your father told me 5 years ago, when he showed me the cave, that one of his children would understand what he had found. He said he would know which one when the time came. He was right. Will you help me? What do you need?" "I found an old mining stove abandoned in a ravine 2 miles from the cave. Its cast iron still intact. I need help moving it, and I need someone who can engineer a ventilation system through the natural chimney shaft in the cave ceiling." Henrik stood and walked to his workbench. He pulled out a sheet of paper and a pencil and began sketching. "A stovepipe system," he said, thinking aloud, "through the natural shaft. We would need to measure the shaft diameter first, then custom fit the pipes, seal them properly to draw smoke up and out without losing heat." He sketched for several minutes while Eleanor watched. Finally, he set down the pencil and looked at her. "This can be done. It will take time, maybe 2 weeks to fabricate the pipes correctly. But yes, it can be done. How much will it cost?" Henrik waved his hand dismissively. "Your father was my friend. He helped me when I needed help. This is what we do. We help each other." Eleanor felt something tight in her chest loosen slightly. "Thank you. When do you want to start?" "As soon as possible. Spring is short. I need to plant by September if I want mature crops before the first snows." Henrik nodded. "Then we start tomorrow." Over the next 4 months, Eleanor Hayes transformed her life. She sold everything she owned that wasn't essential. Her good dress, her mother's jewelry, the small bookshelf her father had built her. She kept only what she needed for work and survival. With the money, she bought seeds. She went to every settler within 20 miles asking for heirloom varieties. Seeds that had been saved and passed down. Varieties that grew well in harsh mountain conditions. Potatoes, turnips, kale, spinach, carrots, onions. Old Mrs. Pemberton, a widow who had homesteaded 40 years earlier, gave her a cloth bag of potato eyes. "These came from my mother's garden in Pennsylvania," she said. "They've grown in every climate I've lived in. Plant them with respect." The O'Brien family Irish settlers who had been farming in the territory for 3 generations gave her onion sets and carrot seeds. "These will grow anywhere," Mrs. O'Brien said. "Even in bad soil, even in short seasons. My grandmother brought them from County Cork, and they've never failed us." By August, Eleanor had accumulated a collection of seeds that represented decades of frontier cultivation knowledge. Each variety had proven itself in Wyoming's harsh conditions. Each had been saved and passed down because it worked. She and Henrik made trips to the cave every week. They hauled the heavy cast iron stove piece by piece, carrying it down the treacherous ravine path. It took 3 trips. By the time they had all the pieces in the cave, both of them were exhausted. But Henrik was true to his word. He measured the natural ventilation shaft, fabricated custom pipe sections in his forge, and installed them with careful engineering. The stove sat on a platform of flat stones, the pipe rising up through the shaft and exiting somewhere on the ravine wall above. They tested it with a small fire. Smoke drew up cleanly, pulled by the natural airflow. The heat radiated into the cave chamber, adding to the geothermal warmth. "This will work," Henrik said with satisfaction. "In the deepest winter you will be warm." Eleanor also brought down canvas cut and sewn into windbreak panels. She strung rope across portions of the cave and hung the canvas to create barriers concentrating warmth in the main chamber. She built a simple frame bed from scavenged wood and rope, a place to sleep during the long hours of tending the garden. She constructed shelves from flat stones and wood planks, storage for tools and harvest. She organized the space like a house with areas for different purposes: sleeping, cooking, working, storage. By late August, the cave had become more than a hole in the ground. It had become a shelter, a workspace, a potential home. Silas Hayes heard the rumors: Eleanor's strange project, her trips to the ravine, the blacksmith helping her move equipment. Town gossip moved faster than telegraph messages, and soon everyone knew that Robert Hayes's youngest daughter was doing something odd at the worthless cave. Silas rode out one afternoon in early September. He found the ravine, left his horse at the top, and climbed down the treacherous path with growing annoyance. By the time he reached the cave entrance, he was sweating despite the cool air. He ducked inside, lamp in hand, and stopped. The cave was transformed. Canvas panels, a stove, organized shelves, and Eleanor kneeling in the soil near the warm pool, mixing something in a wooden bucket. She looked up when his lamplight fell across her. "Silas, what are you doing here?" Eleanor set down the bucket and stood. She was wearing men's trousers and a work shirt, both dirty with soil. Her hair was tied back with a simple cord. She looked nothing like the proper young woman who had attended their father's funeral. "I'm preparing to plant a garden," Silas laughed. The same laugh from the deathbed reading, full of disbelief and something close to contempt. A garden in a cave. Yes. "Eleanor, this is madness. You're wasting time and money on a fantasy. Father was ill. His mind was failing. This cave is worthless." Eleanor walked to a small table she had set up near the stove. She picked up her father's journal and held it out to Silas. "Read this." He took it reluctantly, flipping through pages. His expression changed as he read. Confusion. Then dismissal. "Temperature readings, plant experiments. Eleanor, this proves nothing except that Father wasted years playing with dirt in a cave when he should have been working profitable land. He proved it works. Vegetables grew here, through winter, through conditions that would kill surface crops. A few potatoes don't make this a viable farm. It's not a farm. It's a survival strategy." Silas closed the journal and tossed it back onto the table. "You're deluding yourself. Worse, you're embarrassing the family. People in town are talking. They say Robert Hayes's daughter has lost her mind just like her father did. They pity you." Eleanor met his eyes steadily. "I don't care what they say. You should. You have no husband, no prospects, no resources. When this foolish experiment fails, and it will fail, you'll have nothing. You'll come begging to me or Adelaide for help. I won't." Silas shook his head. He looked around the cave one more time, his expression a mixture of pity and frustration. I hope you realize what you're doing before it's too late. This cave was Father's delusion. Don't make it yours." He left, climbing back up the ravine path without looking back. Eleanor watched him go. Then she returned to her bucket of soil mixture and continued her work. September arrived with the first hints of autumn. The air carried a sharper edge. The high mountain peaks dusted with early snow. Eleanor knew her window was closing. If she was going to plant, it had to be now. She descended into the cave with her collection of seeds and began the work her father had documented so carefully. The soil near the warm pool was rich and dark. She mixed in composted manure she had carried down in small loads over weeks. She added wood ash for nutrients. She worked it with her hands, breaking up clumps, creating the right texture for planting. She laid out beds in careful rows. Potatoes here, each eye placed with exact spacing. Turnips there, seeds pressed into shallow furrows. Kale and spinach in the areas with slightly less direct warmth, where they would grow but not bolt. Carrots in the looser soil. Onion sets near the edge where they could develop slowly. Each seed was placed with thought. Each bed was watered with the warm pool water, creating the perfect moisture for germination. It took her 3 days of continuous work. By the end, her back ached and her hands were raw. But the beds were planted. The cave floor had been transformed into organized rows of potential. Now came the hardest part: waiting, believing, having faith that her father's knowledge was true. Eleanor set up her lamp schedule. She would light the lamp for 6 hours each day, giving the plants the light they needed. The rest of the time, she would work in darkness or by the faint glow from the stove. She moved her few possessions into the cave: the frame bed, a trunk with her clothes, her father's journal, her own notebooks, basic cooking supplies. She was committing, fully, completely, to this cave, to this garden, to this inheritance that everyone else called worthless. On September 15th, 10 days after planting, Eleanor saw the first signs: tiny green shoots breaking through the dark soil, spinach the fastest to germinate. She knelt beside the bed and touched the delicate leaves with gentle fingers. It was working. By the end of September, turnip seedlings had emerged. Potato sprouts pushed through the soil. Kale showed its first true leaves. The cave beds were transforming from rows of dirt into rows of life. Eleanor documented everything in her notebook, following her father's example: germination times, growth rates, plant health. She measured the cave temperature daily. She adjusted her watering schedule based on soil moisture. She was not just growing plants. She was continuing her father's work, adding to the knowledge he had accumulated over 20 years. October brought the first real cold to the territory. Surface gardens froze. Settlers harvested what they could and prepared for winter. Eleanor's siblings went about their lives unaware or unconcerned with what their sister was doing in a ravine 8 miles from town. But in the cave 50 feet below the surface, the temperature remained constant at 50 degrees. The plants grew steadily. Eleanor tended them by lamplight, watching green things thrive in a place where nothing should grow. Henrik visited once a week, bringing supplies and news from town. He never criticized, never doubted. He simply helped where help was needed and left Eleanor to her work. "Your father would be proud," he said during one visit, looking at the thriving beds. Eleanor didn't respond immediately. She was checking the potato plants, looking for signs of the fungal problems her father had noted in his early experiments. "I hope so," she said finally. "I'm trying to honor what he gave me." "You are doing more than that. You are proving his faith was not misplaced." By late October, Eleanor faced her first crisis. A section of the potato bed showed signs of disease. The leaves were yellowing. Brown spots appeared on the stems. She recognized it from her father's notes. Fungal infection. The same problem that had plagued his first plantings. She acted immediately. She removed the infected plants completely, digging them out and carrying them up to the surface to dispose of far from the cave. She adjusted the air circulation around the remaining potatoes, improving drainage, reducing moisture levels slightly. She watched the remaining plants carefully over the next week. The infection did not spread. The healthy potatoes continued to grow. Her father's notes had been right. The problem was manageable if caught early. November arrived. The first blizzard hit the territory, 3 days of wind and snow that buried homesteads and killed livestock caught outside. Eleanor heard the wind howling above ground, but in the cave she was insulated from the worst of it. She spent those 3 days tending her garden, reading her father's journal, and thinking about the winter ahead. The plants were thriving. The potatoes would be ready for harvest in another month. The greens could be harvested continuously. The turnips and carrots were developing well. She had succeeded. She had taken her father's knowledge and proven it worked on a larger scale. But success in the cave meant nothing if she couldn't sustain herself through the full winter. She had enough lamp oil for another 4 months. Enough dried food for 3. After that, she would be dependent entirely on the garden. It was a test, not just of her agricultural skill, but of her commitment, her faith. On November 30th, as early snow fell above ground and the temperature dropped to 10 below zero, Eleanor sat beside the warm pool in the cave and opened her father's journal to the final entry. The handwriting was shakier than earlier entries. This had been written during his illness, probably in the last month of his life. "To my daughter Eleanor," it read, "If you are reading this, then you have found the cave. You have seen what I could not show you while I lived. You have understood what your siblings could not. This cave is not wealth measured in silver or land. It is knowledge. It is the earth's gift to those patient enough to observe, humble enough to learn, and faithful enough to believe what they see, rather than what they are told. I give this to you because you alone have these virtues. You watch where others speak. You listen where others dismiss. You have your mother's patience and your own quiet strength. You will face mockery. Your siblings already believe I have failed you. The town will call this foolish. You will doubt yourself in the dark hours. Trust what you see. The earth does not lie. The warmth rises whether we believe in it or not. The plants grow whether we have faith or not. Your job is simply to observe, to tend, and to continue the work. This is my legacy to you. Not land that can be taken, not money that can be spent, but knowledge that once learned becomes part of who you are. Use it well, my faithful daughter, and know that I am proud of you. Your loving father, Robert Hayes. Eleanor closed the journal carefully. She sat in the warm darkness, the only sound the gentle drip of water from the pool, the soft rustle of growing plants around her. She was alone. 8 miles from town, 50 feet underground, committed to a project that everyone believed was madness. But she was not afraid. Her father had given her more than a map and a journal. He had given her the confidence to trust her own observations, the patience to let things develop in their own time, the faith to believe in what she could not yet see. She stood, checked the stove one more time, adjusted the lamp flame, and walked along the rows of growing vegetables. Everything her father had promised was true. The earth did keep its warmth, and she had been patient enough to find it. Now came the real test. Winter was here, and she was ready. December arrived with deceptive stillness. The first week of the month brought clear skies and temperatures that hovered just below freezing during the day, dropping to bitter cold at night. The kind of weather that made experienced settlers nervous. The calm before the storm. The pause before the land showed its true teeth. Eleanor Hayes knelt in the cave's main chamber, harvesting the first mature vegetables from her underground garden. The spinach had grown thick and dark green, the leaves perfect. She cut them carefully with a sharp knife, placing each bundle into a woven basket at her side. The smell of fresh earth and living plants filled the air, impossibly rich and vital in this space beneath the frozen world above. 43 days since planting. Her father's journal had predicted 45 to 50 for the first spinach harvest. She was ahead of schedule. The kale was ready, too. She moved to the next bed, selecting the outer leaves, leaving the growing centers intact for continuous harvest. The technique her father had documented worked exactly as described. Take the older leaves. Let the plant continue producing. A single kale plant could feed a person for months with this method. Her lamp cast dancing shadows across the cave walls. The warm pool steamed gently, its surface mirror still. The temperature held steady at 51 degrees. Perfect. Eleanor straightened her back, protesting after 2 hours of harvesting. She looked at the bed spread before her. Rows of thriving plants. The potatoes were close to maturity, their foliage healthy and strong. The turnips showed good growth. The carrots were developing deep in the warm soil. The onions stood in neat rows, their green tops reaching toward the lamplight. This was real. This was working. Everything her father had promised, everything she had believed despite the mockery and doubt, was manifesting in dark soil and green leaves. She carried her harvest to the storage area she had organized near the back wall. Stone shelves held clay vessels and woven baskets. She had been preparing for this moment. She washed the greens in water from the pool, shook them dry, and began the process of preservation. Her mother had taught her years ago. Some she would eat fresh. Some she would dry for longer storage. Some she would braid and hang in the coolest part of the cave where they would keep for weeks. The work was meditative, rhythmic. Her hands moved with practiced efficiency while her mind wandered. She thought about the town 8 miles away. The families preparing for winter with their stores of dried goods and salted meat. The careful rationing that had already begun even though the worst weather had not yet arrived. The tight-lipped anxiety that settled over frontier communities when they knew a hard winter was coming, and there was nothing to do but endure it. She thought about her siblings, Silas in his comfortable house, his wheat crop sold and converted to currency, his stores well stocked, but not generous. Adelaide, with her husband Jonathan, their savings carefully managed, their social standing secure. Nathaniel, with his horses and cattle, young and uncertain, following whatever path his older siblings indicated. None of them knew what she had achieved here. None of them would believe it if they saw it. The thought brought neither satisfaction nor bitterness, just a quiet acknowledgement of the distance that had grown between them. They had chosen their inheritances. She had chosen hers. A sound from the cave entrance made her turn. Footsteps on stone. The scrape of boots finding purchase on the steep passage. Henrik Larsson emerged into the lamplight, carrying a canvas pack. His breath came in clouds of white from the cold air outside. Ice crystals clung to his thick beard. "Miss Eleanor," he said, setting down the pack. "I brought supplies and news." Eleanor wiped her hands on her work apron and gestured to the flat rock near the stove, where she had set up a simple sitting area. "Sit. Warm yourself." Henrik lowered himself onto the rock with a grateful sigh. He held his hands toward the stove, rubbing them together. Eleanor poured hot water from the kettle into 2 tin cups and added a pinch of dried herbs. She handed one to Henrik. "What news?" "The old-timers are talking," Henrik said, wrapping his hands around the warm cup. "They say this winter will be bad. Very bad. Worse than the winter of '78. And that one killed livestock and people both." "How do they know?" "Signs. The way the animals behaved in autumn. How thick the pine cones grew. The early snow on the high peaks. The geese flying south 2 weeks earlier than normal." He took a sip of the herbal tea. "I do not put all my faith in such signs, but men who have lived here 40 years, they notice patterns." Eleanor sat across from him on her simple wooden stool. "How is the town preparing?" "Carefully. Dr. Morrison has been visiting homesteads, checking on the elderly and the children, making sure families have adequate stores. Some do not. Some will struggle even with a mild winter." Henrik's expression grew serious. "If the old-timers are right, if this winter is as harsh as they fear, people will suffer. And my siblings. Silas is comfortable. He has resources, Adelaide and Jonathan too. Nathaniel is young and strong, but his claim is exposed to the wind. He may have trouble keeping his livestock alive." Eleanor looked at her harvest baskets. Fresh vegetables in December. Food that could make the difference between health and sickness, between enduring and suffering. When do they think the worst will come? Mid-month, maybe sooner. Henrik set down his cup and met her eyes. "Eleanor, you should know. Dr. Morrison asked about you. He wondered if you were still at the cave. When I said yes, he became concerned. He thinks you should return to town before the storms make travel impossible." "I'm staying." "He said you would say that." Henrik smiled slightly. "He asked me to tell you that isolation in severe cold can be dangerous. That even healthy people can succumb to hypothermia, to accidents, to sickness without help nearby. I'm safer here than in town. This cave maintains warmth. I have food. I have shelter. I have everything I need." "For how long?" Eleanor had done the calculations a dozen times. Lamp oil, firewood, dried stores, the garden's production rate. 4 months, maybe 5 if I ration carefully. By then it will be March. The worst will be over." Henrik nodded slowly. He looked around the cave, taking in the organized beds, the stored supplies the evidence of careful planning. Your father would be very proud of what you have built here. I hope so. There is something else. Henrik reached into his coat and withdrew a folded letter. This came to my shop 3 days ago. It is addressed to you, but sent in care of me since you have no address in town anymore. Eleanor took the letter. The paper was fine quality. The handwriting was elegant. She recognized it immediately. Adelaide. She broke the seal and unfolded the letter. Dearest Eleanor, I hope this letter finds you well and in good health. I've been thinking much about you in these recent weeks as winter approaches. I know we have not always seen eye to eye regarding Father's final wishes, and I confess I may have been less understanding than I should have been. However, as the weather grows cold and the predictions grow dire, I find myself increasingly concerned for your welfare. This cave project, whatever its merits or lack thereof, should not cost you your life or your health. I am writing to extend a sincere invitation. My home has adequate space. You would be welcome to stay through the winter months in comfort and safety. We could put aside our differences and remember that we are family bound by blood and by Father's memory. Please consider this offer seriously. Pride is a cold companion in the depths of winter. Come to town. Stay with me. Let this obsession go before it costs you everything. Your loving sister, Adelaide Eleanor, read the letter twice. The words were kind. The offer was genuine, or at least appeared to be. Adelaide was reaching out in her own way, trying to bridge the gap that had opened between them. But beneath the kindness was an assumption that the cave was an obsession, that Eleanor was being foolish, that abandoning the project was the reasonable, sensible thing to do. Adelaide could not see what Eleanor saw, could not understand what their father had given her. The letter was an attempt at reconciliation built on fundamental misunderstanding. Eleanor folded the letter and set it aside. You will not go, Henrik said. It was not a question. No. She means well, I think. I know she does, but she's asking me to abandon the one thing Father trusted me with. She's asking me to prove her right, that this was foolish from the start. And if the winter is as bad as predicted, Eleanor met his eyes, then I will have food and warmth when others do not. I will have vindication, and I will have honored my father's faith in me. Henrik stood brushing off his trousers. He picked up his empty cup and handed it to Eleanor. Then I will check on you when I can, if the storms allow. If not, I will come when the weather breaks. Thank you, Henrik, for everything. He paused at the cave entrance, looking back at her one more time. Your father told me once that you had steel in your spine that your siblings lacked. I did not fully understand what he meant then. I do now. Then he was gone, climbing up the steep passage toward the surface world. Eleanor was alone again. The cave's silence settled around her like a blanket. She returned to her work, hanging kale to dry, storing turnips in cool sand, recording the day's harvest in her journal. The work was good. The solitude was familiar. But Henrik's words about the coming storm lingered in her mind. She checked her supplies that evening by lamplight. Lamp oil, 3 full containers enough for perhaps 90 days at current usage. She could reduce her lighting hours if necessary, extend it to 120 days. Firewood for the stove a good supply, but she made a note to gather more when she ventured to the surface next. dried beans and grains adequate, salt sufficient. Her father's old rifle and ammunition clean and ready, though she hoped not to need them. Water was not a concern. The warm pool provided endless supply. Food was not a concern. The garden produced more than she could eat alone. The real concern was isolation. If something went wrong, if she fell ill or injured herself, no one would know. No one would come. But that was the price of commitment, the cost of proving her father right. She settled onto her frame bed that night, with her father's journal open in her lap. She had read it cover to cover 3 times now, but certain passages called to her repeatedly. One entry dated 15 years earlier stood out. "Today I brought Adelaide down to the cave. She was 15. I thought perhaps she would see what I see. I showed her the warm water, explained the possibility. She was polite but disinterested. She asked when we could return to the house. She did not understand. I realize now that understanding cannot be taught. It must be inherent. Some people see possibility where others see only what is immediately obvious. Adelaide sees the cave as a hole in the ground, because that is all she chooses to see. But Eleanor watches. Even at 6 years old, she notices things. The way water moves, the pattern of birds in flight. She asks questions that show observation rather than idle curiosity. If I have one child who will understand what I have found, here it will be Eleanor. Eleanor closed the journal carefully and set it aside. She extinguished the lamp, conserving oil, and lay in the darkness listening to the subtle sounds of the cave. The drip of water, the whisper of air through the ventilation shaft, the soft settling of stone that had stood for thousands of years and would stand for thousands more. Her father had chosen her not out of favoritism but out of recognition. He had seen in her the qualities necessary to receive this gift. She would not fail him. December 10th brought the first real warning. The temperature above ground dropped to 15 below zero overnight. When Eleanor climbed to the surface to gather firewood from a stand of dead pine, a quarter-mile from the ravine, she saw the sky had changed. A flat grayness that pressed down on the land. The air smelled of snow and deep cold. She worked quickly, gathering what she could carry, moving with efficient urgency. The wind had picked up bitter and cutting. Her exposed skin ached within minutes. She made 3 trips hauling wood down the treacherous ravine path and stacking it near the cave entrance under an overhang that would keep it dry. By the 3rd trip, her hands were numb despite her gloves, and her face felt frozen. The sky had darkened further. The grayness had taken on weight and texture. Eleanor made it back to the cave just as the first snow began to fall. She sealed the entrance with doubled canvas barriers she had prepared for this purpose, leaving only a small gap for air circulation. The cave's warmth met the incoming cold air, creating a delicate balance that would maintain her environment while preventing heat loss. Inside, the temperature remained steady, 50 degrees, constant, safe. She tended her garden that evening with extra care, checking each plant for signs of stress from the barometric pressure changes. Plants were sensitive to weather shifts, even underground. But the beds showed no distress. The vegetables continued their slow, steady growth, indifferent to the storm gathering above. The snow fell for 2 days. When it finally stopped, Eleanor cautiously opened her canvas barrier and looked out. The world had transformed. Snow lay in drifts that altered the entire landscape. The path she had used to access the ravine was buried under 4 feet of accumulation. The ravine itself had become a channel of white smoothing over the rough stone and making everything unfamiliar. But it was not yet the great storm. This was just a prelude, a first test. Eleanor took stock. Her firewood supply was good. Her food was adequate. Her lamp oil would last. The garden thrived. She could endure a long siege if necessary. She withdrew into the cave and returned to her routines, tending the plants, cooking simple meals on her stove, reading by lamplight in the evenings, recording observations in her journal, sleeping in the warm darkness. The isolation was profound. Days passed without human contact, without voices other than her own, without anything beyond the steady rhythm of plant care and survival maintenance. She talked to herself sometimes, working through problems aloud. She talked to the plants, describing what she was doing as she watered or harvested or checked for pests. The solitude was not loneliness exactly. It was something else, a stripping away of social performance, a reduction to essential self. There was no one to impress, no one to convince, no role to play. Just Eleanor and the work and the warm earth. On December 14th, she harvested her first potatoes. She had been checking them carefully, watching for the signs her father had documented. The foliage beginning to yellow slightly, the stems losing their vibrant green, the subtle settling of the soil as the tubers matured below. She chose one plant, digging carefully around it with her hands, not wanting to damage any roots. Her fingers found the first potato, firm, smooth, the size of her fist. She lifted it free from the soil, brushing off the dirt. Perfect. She continued digging, following the root system. The single plant yielded 7 potatoes, all healthy, all good size. Eleanor sat back on her heels, holding her harvest. 7 potatoes from one eye. Her father's journal had predicted 5 to 8. She was within the expected range. It worked. It all worked. She harvested 3 more plants that day, selecting carefully, leaving the rest to continue growing. 22 potatoes in total, enough for several weeks of meals. And this was just the beginning. She had 30 more plants thriving in the beds. She washed the potatoes in pool water and stored them in a woven basket lined with sand. They would keep for months in the cave's constant cool temperature. That evening, she roasted 1 potato in the stove's coals and ate it with dried salt and a handful of fresh kale. The meal was simple, perfect. The potato was sweet and mealy, better than any she had tasted before. The kale was crisp and slightly bitter in the way that spoke of good nutrition and clean growth. She was eating fresh food in mid-December in Wyoming territory. Food she had grown herself in a cave 50 feet underground using her dead father's documented wisdom. The absurdity and the triumph of it struck her simultaneously. She sat alone in the lamplight and allowed herself a moment of satisfaction, of pride. Her father had been right. She had been right to believe him. And soon, when the worst of winter came and passed, everyone else would know it too. But first, she had to survive what was coming. December 15th dawned gray and ominous. Eleanor woke before dawn, her body attuned to rhythms that had nothing to do with the sun she could not see. She lit her lamp and checked the cave entrance. The canvas barriers were holding, but she could hear something different in the airflow, a change in pressure, a heaviness. She prepared a larger breakfast than usual. Instinct told her to eat well to build reserves. She cooked turnips and potatoes together with the last of her dried onions, making a simple hash that filled her small tin plate twice. After eating, she checked every aspect of her cave shelter. The stove was drawing well. The ventilation was clear. The firewood was stacked and dry. The water in the pool was warm and clean. The plants were healthy. The storage was organized. Everything was as ready as human effort could make it. She settled near the warm pool with her father's journal and read his accounts of previous hard winters. The winter of '78. The winter of '81. Storms that lasted days. Temperatures that killed exposed livestock in hours. Snow that buried homesteads until only the chimney smoke revealed human habitation below. But through it all, her father had noted the cave maintained its warmth. The earth's deep heat rose whether the surface was frozen or not. She was safe here, safer than anyone above ground. The thought should have been comforting. Instead, it made her think of Henrik, of Dr. Morrison, of all the people in town who would face the coming storm with only their thin-walled houses and limited stores. Eleanor pushed the thought aside. She could not help them now. She could barely help herself. Her task was to survive and to prove her father's wisdom. Everything else was beyond her control. The storm hit at mid-afternoon. The sound came first, a roar like distant thunder that grew steadily louder. Wind, but wind unlike anything Eleanor had experienced. It screamed across the landscape above a physical force that seemed to shake the earth itself. The temperature outside the cave entrance dropped so fast, Eleanor could feel the change even through her canvas barriers. The small gap she left for air circulation became a knife edge of cold. She closed it completely and relied on the natural ventilation through the stove chimney. The cave's air supply was adequate through that channel alone. Then, the real cold came. Eleanor had experienced Wyoming winters. She knew what 20 below felt like, what 30 below felt like. But this was something else. This was cold that came from the deep north, from places where winter ruled absolutely, and life retreated to its most minimal expressions. The thermometer she kept near the cave entrance, measuring the outside temperature, through a small insulated port dropped to -40 degrees, then -45. Inside the cave, the temperature held at 48 degrees. The geothermal warmth pushed back against the invading cold, creating a stable pocket of survivable air. Eleanor fed the stove steadily, maintaining heat that supplemented the earth's natural warmth. She wore 2 layers of wool and kept moving, tending the plants, organizing supplies, doing anything that generated body heat. The storm's roar was constant, unending. A howl that penetrated even 50 feet of stone and soil. It was the sound of a landscape being scoured, of winter showing no mercy. The town would be sealed tight, every door and window shuttered. Every family huddled near their stoves, burning precious wood and coal rationing warmth. Her siblings would be in their homes. Silas comfortable but concerned. Adelaide and Jonathan warm but worried. Nathaniel young and possibly frightened. And she was here, in the earth, in the warmth, safe. The contradiction gnawed at her. She had what they lacked, But she lacked what they had: human contact, shared struggle, the comfort of voices in the dark. She was proving her point, but the cost was complete isolation. The storm raged for 3 days without pause. Eleanor maintained her routines with fierce discipline. Wake, tend the fire, check the plants, harvest what was ready, cook simple meals, read by lamplight, record observations, sleep. The garden provided daily harvest now: kale, spinach, small turnips ready to pull. The continuous production was exactly as her father had predicted. Take what you need. Let the rest continue growing. The warmth and the cycle continue regardless of conditions above. But the isolation pressed down like the weight of the stone overhead. No voices, no faces, no variation in her environment beyond the small changes in plant growth. She caught herself talking to the plants more frequently, narrating her actions, having one-sided conversations. The potatoes are developing well, Father. You were right about the spacing. Adelaide, you should see the kale. This is not obsession. This is practical survival. Silas, I'm eating fresh vegetables while you're rationing hardtack. The words echoed in the cave and died. No one answered. No one heard. On the 4th day, the wind finally lessened. The constant roar diminished to a howl, then to a moan, then to something almost like normal wind. Eleanor cautiously opened a small gap in her canvas barriers and looked out. The world was white, completely white. Snow had drifted to depths that made the ravine almost unrecognizable. The path up was buried. The entire landscape had been reshaped by wind and accumulation. The temperature was minus 38 degrees. Still brutally cold, but the worst of the wind had passed. Eleanor closed the barrier again. She was not going anywhere. Not for days. Maybe not for weeks. The snow was too deep. The cold was too severe. Travel would be suicide. She was committed now. Completely. There was no going back to town even if she wanted to. This cave was her world. This garden was her life. This isolation was her choice. She returned to her routines. The plants needed tending regardless of storms. The harvest continued regardless of snow depth above. 1 week became 2. The storm settled into a pattern. Days of howling wind and blowing snow. Brief, clear periods where the temperature plummeted even further. Then more snow, more wind, more relentless assault. Eleanor lost track of exact days. Her calendar markings became approximate. She measured time by lamp oil consumption and plant growth cycles instead of dates. She was down to her 2nd container of oil, 60 days worth at current usage. She reduced her lighting hours, working more in dimness conserving. Her dried food stores were being depleted faster than planned. The extreme cold made her body demand more fuel. She was eating more to maintain warmth. The calculations were changing, but the garden compensated. She was harvesting continuously now. Kale every other day. Spinach twice a week. Turnips and potatoes as needed. The plants were producing more than she could eat alone. She was surviving. not just enduring but actually thriving in this strange underground world while the surface was locked in winter's worst grip. But thriving alone, without witness, without validation, without any way to prove to her siblings or to the town that her father's gift was real. 3 weeks into the siege, Eleanor woke in the middle of her sleep cycle with a realization that made her sit upright in the darkness. She had no idea how the town was faring. The storm had been worse than any prediction. The cold was beyond what even the old-timers had forecast. If this had gone on for 3 weeks, if it continued for another 3 or 6 weeks, what was happening to the families with limited stores? What was happening to the elderly, the children, the weak? Her vegetables could feed more than just herself. Her harvest was continuous. She had abundance in the middle of famine. But she was trapped here, sealed in by snow and cold, unable to help even if she wanted to. The thought haunted her as she lay back down. She had proven her father right. She had created a miracle of survival. But what good was abundance if it could not be shared? Sleep was slow to return. The 4th week brought a brief break in the weather. The wind died completely. The sky cleared to a pale, merciless blue. The temperature remained brutally cold, but the snow had stopped. Eleanor made a decision. She would try to reach the surface, not to go to town that was still impossible, but to see, to understand what had happened to the land above her sanctuary. She dressed in every layer she owned. Wool trousers, 2 shirts, a heavy coat, gloves, a scarf wrapped around her face until only her eyes showed. She took her father's old rifle more for the psychological comfort than any real expectation of needing it. The climb up the ravine was treacherous. The path she had used was gone, buried under snow that had drifted and packed hard. She had to find new routes, climbing over snow that sometimes held her weight and sometimes collapsed, dropping her hip-deep into powder. It took an hour to reach the ravine rim. By the time she pulled herself over the top, she was sweating despite the cold, and her breath came in gasps that froze her lungs. She stood on the surface and looked out at a transformed world. Snow stretched in every direction, white and unbroken, except for the dark shapes of rocks and the occasional windswept ridge where stone showed through. The mountains in the distance were lost in haze. The sky was pale and empty, and it was silent, completely silent. No birds, no animal sounds, no wind. Just the absolute quiet of a frozen world where life had retreated so far into hiding it might as well not exist. Eleanor turned slowly, taking in the full scope of what winter had done. To the east, she could barely make out the distant smudge that might have been smoke from the town. Barely visible. Almost nothing. The town was 8 miles away. Through snow this deep and cold, this severe, it might as well have been 800. She was cut off. Completely. The isolation she had chosen was now enforced by nature itself. Eleanor stood in the bitter cold and made herself face a truth she had been avoiding. If people were suffering in town, she could do nothing about it. Not now. Maybe not for weeks. Her garden and her abundance meant nothing if she could not share them. She could survive perfectly and others could die, and she would know nothing until the spring thaw. The thought was like the cold itself, penetrating, inescapable. She turned and began the difficult descent back to the cave, back to her warm sanctuary, back to her thriving garden and her isolation. But something had shifted in her. The satisfaction of survival was no longer enough. She needed to know what was happening beyond her stone walls. She needed to find a way to help if help was needed. The question was whether winter would allow it, whether the land would permit human agency to matter at all in the face of its absolute power. Eleanor reached the cave entrance and sealed herself back inside the warmth. She tended her fire. She checked her plants. She ate her fresh vegetables and drank her warm water. But her mind was in the town, with the families, with the children and the elderly and the weak. And for the first time since descending into the earth, she felt the weight of what she had chosen. Not regret, but responsibility. The burden of having plenty when others had little. The moral complexity of survival that came at the cost of complete separation from community. She sat near the warm pool that night and thought about her father, about the legacy he had given her, about what it meant to honor that legacy. Was it enough to prove he was right to survive when others had mocked, or was there a deeper purpose to the gift? A reason beyond personal vindication? The questions had no easy answers, but they would not leave her alone. Outside, the winter night deepened. The temperature dropped further, and Eleanor Hayes, warm and fed and utterly isolated in her cave beneath the frozen earth, wrestled with the meaning of the inheritance her father had given her. Before retreating fully into the cave for what she knew would be weeks more of isolation, Eleanor made one final decision. She would send her companion to safety. Her dog, Ash, the gray and white herding dog, who had followed her faithfully on every trip to the cave, sat watching her with patient eyes. He had been her constant companion through the preparation months, sleeping beside her bed, alerting her to sounds outside. But Eleanor knew what was coming. The deep winter, the long isolation, the potential dangers of being trapped underground with limited food. "Henrik will take care of you," she said, kneeling beside Ash and running her hands through his thick fur. "You'll be safer in town, warmer, better fed." The next time Henrik visited in early December, before the worst storms hit, Eleanor handed him Ash's rope. "Keep him safe," she said. "I'll come for him in spring." Henrik nodded understanding. "He will be well cared for. You have my word." As Eleanor watched Henrik and Ash climb up the ravine path disappearing into the gray afternoon, she felt the last connection to the world above severing. Now it was truly just her and the cave, her and her father's legacy. She turned back to the entrance, sealed it against the coming storms, and descended into the warm darkness alone. The town of Clearwater huddled beneath a sky the color of old ice. January had arrived without ceremony, simply an extension of December's brutality. The blizzard that had begun before Christmas had never truly ended. It had paused, caught its breath, and returned with renewed violence. Now, 6 weeks into the siege, the town existed in a state of grim endurance. Silas Hayes stood at the window of his house, looking out at a world reduced to shades of white and gray. Snow had drifted against the northern wall of his home to the level of the second-floor windows. The street outside was impassable except on foot, and even that was treacherous. Families moved between houses only when absolutely necessary, creating trenches through the snow that connected the essential buildings, the general store, the doctor's office, The church that doubled as a gathering hall. His breath frosted the glass. He wiped it clear with his sleeve and continued his vigil, though he did not know exactly what he was watching for. The wheat he had sold in autumn seemed like a memory from another life. The money from that sale, carefully hoarded, meant nothing when there was nothing left to buy. The general store's shelves had been picked clean before New Year. What remained was being rationed with desperate precision. Hardtack, salt pork that was more salt than pork, dried beans that took precious fuel to cook properly, and even then sat heavy in the gut without truly satisfying. Silas's own stores were better than most. He had planned well. But even his planning had not accounted for this. No one's planning had accounted for this. Behind him, in the main room of the house, his wife, Sarah, sat near the stove with their 2 children. The boy, 7 years old, was wrapped in blankets despite being indoors. The girl, 5, had stopped complaining about hunger 3 days ago. That worried Silas more than the complaints had. "Papa," the boy said, his voice thin, "when will we have real food again?" Silas turned from the window. His son's face was pale, the skin around his mouth showing the first subtle signs of scurvy. The bleeding gums. The lethargy. Soon, Silas lied. When the weather breaks. But the weather showed no signs of breaking. And even when it did, even when they could finally access the stored supplies in outlying barns and caches, the damage would already be done. People would have starved. People would have died. The thought sat in Silas's chest like a stone. 3 houses down, Adelaide Hayes Porter stood in her kitchen, carefully measuring out the morning rations. A cup of beans for the family. A small piece of salt pork the size of her thumb. Water from melted snow. The beans would have to cook for hours to become edible. The precious firewood that required would come from furniture they had already begun breaking apart. Yesterday it was a chair. Today it might be the small table in the spare room. Her husband, Jonathan, had stopped going to his law office 2 weeks ago. There was no law to practice when everyone was simply trying to survive. He sat in the front room, now wrapped in a blanket, conserving energy. Adelaide's hands shook slightly as she measured. Not from cold, from something deeper. A recognition that had been growing in her for weeks, but which she had refused to name. She had been wrong. The thought came unbidden and would not leave. She had been wrong about the cave, wrong about her father, wrong about Eleanor. When she had visited Eleanor back in September, offering shelter and calling the cave project an obsession, she had been so certain, so confident in her understanding of what was practical and what was foolish. But now, standing in her kitchen rationing beans while her children showed signs of malnutrition, Adelaide found her certainty had crumbled. Eleanor was in that cave, alone. And Adelaide had no idea if her youngest sister was alive or dead, if she had survived the blizzard, or if her body lay frozen in some snow-filled ravine. The guilt was a physical thing, a weight in her stomach that had nothing to do with hunger. She had mocked. She had dismissed. She had laughed. And now she did not know if she would ever have the chance to apologize. Dr. Augustus Morrison made his daily rounds on foot, moving between houses, with the weariness of a man fighting a battle he was slowly losing. The Fitzgerald child had died 3 days ago. Pneumonia complicated by malnutrition. The mother had wept. The father had stood silent, his face like carved stone. Old Mr. Brennan was failing. Scurvy had progressed to the point where his teeth were loose and his legs would not hold him. Morrison gave him what comfort he could, but there was no medicine for starvation, no treatment for systematic nutritional collapse. The pattern was repeating across the town. The weakest going first, the elderly, the very young, those with underlying illness, and there was nothing Morrison could do beyond document it. Beyond bearing witness to winter's merciless culling, he trudged through the snow toward the porterhouse, checking on Adelaide's children. They were better off than most, but even they were showing signs. The lethargy, the bleeding gums, the hollow look around the eyes. Morrison was a man of science, a man of empirical observation and rational analysis. But standing in this frozen town, watching people decline day by day, he found himself thinking thoughts that had no place in scientific discourse. He thought about Eleanor Hayes, the stubborn young woman who had insisted on staying at a worthless cave through the winter. The fool, as he had called her privately. If she was still alive, which seemed doubtful, she was probably suffering less than those in town. The cave would at least provide shelter from the wind. Constant temperature, however cold, but alone. Completely alone. That was its own form of death, perhaps. Morrison reached the porterhouse and knocked. Adelaide opened the door, her face thin and drawn. "Doctor." "Mrs. Porter, I've come to check on the children." She stepped aside to let him enter. The house was cold despite the stove burning. Furniture was being sacrificed for heat, but it was not enough. It was never enough. Morrison examined the children with practiced efficiency. The boy showed moderate scurvy, the girl less so. Both were malnourished, but not yet critical. "Continue the rationing as you have been," he said quietly to Adelaide. "And if you have any dried fruit at all, anything with preserved nutrients, give it to them." "We have nothing, Doctor. We've been eating the same as everyone else." Morrison nodded. He had expected as much. "Then we wait, and we hope the weather breaks before the worst happens." After he left, Adelaide stood in her cold kitchen and allowed herself to cry. Quiet tears that fell without sound. For her children. For her father. For her sister who might be dead in a frozen cave because Adelaide had not believed in something she should have believed in. In the small house at the edge of town, Nathaniel Hayes sat with his head in his hands. His cattle were dead. All 6. He had tried to keep them alive, had brought them into the barn, and rationed feed and done everything he knew how to do. But the cold had been too severe. The stress too much. They had died one by one over 3 weeks, and he had been forced to butcher them in freezing conditions, storing the meat in the snow outside. The meat had helped. It had kept him and his young wife alive when others were starving on hardtack alone. But the cattle represented his future, his father's legacy, his chance to build something. Now they were gone. Converted to frozen carcasses that would feed him for a few more weeks. And then he would be like everyone else, running on empty, hoping for spring. Nathaniel thought about his siblings, Silas, who had always been so sure of himself, Adelaide, who had always known what was proper and practical, and Eleanor, who had taken the worthless cave and disappeared into it with absolute conviction. Nathaniel had not understood her choice, had thought her strange and stubborn like their father, had been relieved when the valuable inheritances went to the older siblings, and all he had to manage was livestock. But now, sitting in his cold house with his dead cattle and his frightened wife, Nathaniel wondered, what if Eleanor had been right? What if their father had known something? They had all been too proud or too certain to see. The question had no answer. Eleanor was 8 miles away through impassable snow. She might be alive. She might be dead. There was no way to know. Nathaniel stood and went to the window. The pale winter sun was already setting, though it was barely past 3 in the afternoon. The short days and long nights made everything worse, made the cold feel deeper, made the hunger feel more acute. He thought about riding out to the ravine, about checking on his youngest sister. But it was suicide to travel in this weather. The cold would kill him before he covered a mile, so he stood at the window and did nothing like everyone else in town, waiting, enduring, hoping. And in his chest, a small seed of shame had begun to grow. Henrik Larsson's blacksmith shop had become a gathering place for the men of the town, not for work. There was no work, but for warmth and for the illusion of purpose. The forge had not been lit in 2 weeks. Fuel was too precious to waste on metal that no one needed shaping. But the building retained some heat, and men came to sit on the benches and talk in low voices about things that did not matter. Henrik sat apart from them, his mind 8 miles away. Eleanor's dog Ash lay at his feet, the animal's presence a constant reminder of the promise he had made. He had promised Eleanor he would check on her when he could. But the blizzard had made that impossible. The snow was too deep, the cold too severe. He was a strong man, but he was not a fool. Traveling to the ravine in these conditions would be certain death. Still, the promise gnawed at him. The responsibility he had accepted not just to Eleanor, but to her father. Robert Hayes had been his friend, had helped him in dark times. The least Henrik could do was ensure the man's daughter survived the winter she had chosen. But if she had not survived, if she had frozen or starved or succumbed to any of the dozen dangers that isolation presented, Henrik would never forgive himself. He stood and walked to the shop door, looking out at the snow-covered street. A few figures moved between buildings, hunched against the cold. Everyone looked thinner. Everyone moved more slowly. The town was dying by degrees, and there was nothing anyone could do but endure. Henrik thought about the cave, about the warm water he had seen rising from the earth, about Eleanor's careful plans and her absolute faith in her father's documented wisdom. If she had made it work, if the garden had grown, if the warmth had sustained her. But that was too much to hope for, too miraculous to be real. Henrik turned away from the door and sat back down. Ash whined softly, sensing his agitation. "I know, boy," Henrik said, quietly running his hand over the dog's head. "I miss her too. We'll go to her when the weather allows, I promise." He would wait until the weather broke. Then he would make the journey whatever he found at the end of it. Until then, there was nothing to do but survive like everyone else. On January 20th, something shifted. The wind, which had been a constant presence for 6 weeks, died to nothing. The snow stopped falling. The sky cleared to a pale blue that hurt the eyes with its brightness. The temperature remained brutally cold, -35 degrees. But without the wind, without the driving snow, it was bearable. Barely. Silas stood at his window and felt something stir in his chest. Not quite hope. Not quite relief. Something else. A breaking point reached. He had watched his children decline for weeks, had rationed food with mathematical precision and watched it not be enough, had burned furniture to keep them warm, and knew the fuel was running out. And somewhere 8 miles away, his sister was in a cave, alive or dead, suffering or surviving, and he did not know which. The uncertainty had become unbearable. Worse than knowledge, even bad knowledge. The not knowing. The responsibility of mockery unpaid for. Silas made a decision. He would try to reach the cave. Not to rescue Eleanor, though if she needed rescue, he would provide it. But to know. To see. To face what his dismissal had created. He dressed in his warmest clothes and told his wife where he was going. Sarah looked at him with hollow eyes and said nothing. She had stopped arguing weeks ago. Stopped caring about anything beyond keeping the children breathing. Silas left the house and began walking west. The snow was packed hard enough to hold his weight in most places. Where it did not, he broke through hip deep and struggled forward with sheer determination. He made it half a mile before the cold defeated him. His fingers went numb inside his gloves. His face felt frozen despite the scarf. His breath came in gasps that burned his lungs. He turned back, defeated, humiliated. He could not even reach his sister to apologize for his mockery. Could not face the consequences of his certainty. Henrik found Silas an hour later, sitting on a snowdrift 2 blocks from his house, staring at nothing. Ash trotted beside Henrik, the dog's breath coming in white clouds. "Silas, you should not be out here." Silas looked up. His face was pale with cold. "I tried to reach Eleanor. I couldn't. I failed." Henrik helped him stand. "The cold is too severe. No one can make that journey now." "Then she's dead. She must be dead. No one could survive this alone." Henrik was quiet for a moment. Then he said something that surprised himself. "Your sister is stronger than you think, and your father was wiser than you believed." Silas pulled away, angry suddenly. "You don't know that. No one knows. She could be frozen in that cave right now, and we would have no idea. Perhaps. But I knew your father. I knew what he found in that cave, and I know Eleanor. If anyone could make his vision work, it would be her." Silas stared at Henrik. Then something in his expression crumbled. "I mocked her. I called her a fool. I told her she was wasting her life on a dying man's delusion. Yes, I was wrong, wasn't I?" Henrik met his eyes steadily. "We will find out when the weather allows. Until then, you should be with your family." He guided Silas back toward his house. The younger man went without resistance, the fight gone out of him. Ash followed occasionally, looking back west, as if sensing something in that direction. Henrik returned to his shop and stood in the doorway looking west toward where the ravine lay hidden beneath snow and distance. "Hold on, Eleanor," he said quietly. "Hold on a little longer." In the cave, Eleanor Hayes harvested kale by lamplight, unaware of the town's suffering, unaware of Silas's failed attempt to reach her, unaware that she had been given up for dead by most of the people who had known her. Her world had contracted to this chamber, these plants, this warmth, this isolation. But the isolation was beginning to fracture. For 3 days, the clear weather held. The temperature remained severe but stable. And on the evening of January 23rd, Eleanor made a decision. She would try to reach the surface again, not to travel to town that was still impossible, but to see, to understand what the clear skies might reveal. The climb up the ravine was brutal. The snow had compacted and refrozen multiple times, creating a surface that was sometimes solid enough to climb and sometimes collapsed without warning. Eleanor fell twice, sliding 10 feet down packed snow, before catching herself on exposed rock. But she was determined, driven by something she could not name, a need to see beyond her cave walls, to connect with the world outside her sanctuary. She reached the ravine rim at sunset. The sky was turning colors she had forgotten existed. Orange, pink, deep purple at the edges. The snow reflected the light, creating a landscape of impossible beauty and absolute cold. Eleanor stood and looked east, toward where the town lay. And this time she saw something. Not smoke. Not from this distance. But something else. A darkness in the snow. A wrongness in the pattern that suggested human habitation. Structures. Life. Or maybe death. She could not tell from here. But it was there. The town existed. People existed. And she had been sealed in her warm cave for 6 weeks, while they endured something she could only imagine. The guilt hit her like the cold, sharp, penetrating. She had abundance. They had nothing. She had warmth. They had winter's worst. She had survived perfectly while they struggled and possibly died. Eleanor turned in a slow circle, taking in the full scope of the frozen landscape. Then she looked down at the cave entrance below, her barely visible under its covering of snow and canvas. She could go back down, return to her sanctuary, wait out the rest of winter in safety and comfort, emerge in spring vindicated and healthy and completely disconnected from the shared human experience of suffering. Or she could try to help. The distance was 8 miles, through snow, in killing cold, carrying what food that would freeze solid before she had gone a mile, vegetables that would be worthless ice by the time she reached town. It was impossible. Practically, logistically, physically impossible. Eleanor stood at the ravine edge as the sun set and the temperature began its nightly plunge. She stood until the cold forced her back down to the cave, to the warmth, to the safety. But the guilt came with her, and the question, and the responsibility. She spent that night awake, sitting near the warm pool, thinking. Her father's journal lay open in her lap. She had read it so many times she knew passages by heart. But tonight she turned to the final entry, the one addressed to her directly. This is my legacy to you. Not land that can be taken, not money that can be spent, but knowledge that once learned becomes part of who you are. Use it well, my faithful daughter. Use it well. Eleanor closed the journal slowly. The words echoed in the quiet cave. She had proven the knowledge worked, had created a thriving garden, had survived winter's worst in comfort and safety. But was that enough? Was survival alone the point of the gift? Or was there something more her father had intended? Something about legacy that extended beyond personal vindication? The answer came to her, slowly building like water pressure behind a dam. The knowledge was not meant to be hoarded. The abundance was not meant for one person. The legacy was not about Eleanor Hayes proving everyone wrong. It was about Eleanor Hayes having something to offer when offering mattered most. The realization settled into her bones with the certainty of truth. She had to try to reach the town, had to attempt to share what her father's wisdom had provided, even if it was dangerous, even if it failed, even if she could only help a little. Because the alternative was to emerge in spring healthy and vindicated, having let people die when she might have saved them. And that would make her father's gift meaningless, would reduce it to mere survival instead of something greater. Eleanor stood and began to plan. The next morning, she started her preparations. She needed food that would travel. That would not freeze immediately. That would provide maximum nutrition and minimum weight. She harvested aggressively. Potatoes, turnips, carrots, all the root vegetables that could withstand cold. She packed them in baskets lined with canvas, insulated as well as she could manage. She harvested armfuls of kale and spinach, knowing they would likely freeze, but hoping that frozen greens might still have some nutritional value if thawed and cooked. She bundled onions in braided strings, gathered dried herbs that would help flavor the bland rations people were surely eating. 3 baskets, 40 pounds of vegetables total, more than she could carry alone even over short distance. Impossible over 8 miles of snow. But she would try. On the morning of January the 24th, Eleanor packed her supplies and began the journey. She carried 1 basket on her back, secured with rope. 1 she held in her arms. The 3rd, she pulled on a makeshift sled she had constructed from scavenged wood. The climb out of the ravine took an hour. The vegetables added weight that made every step treacherous. She fell 3 times. Once she nearly lost a basket over the edge, but she recovered, adjusted, continued. At the top, she stopped to catch her breath. The sun was fully up now. The temperature was minus 28 degrees. Brutal, but not immediately fatal if she kept moving. She looked east toward the town, 8 miles, through snow. Carrying 40 pounds, it should have been impossible. Eleanor started walking. The first mile was manageable. The snow was packed hard enough in most places. The sled dragged behind her with reasonable ease. The basket in her arms was heavy but bearable. The second mile was harder. Her legs began to ache. The cold worked its way through her layers. Her breath came in clouds that froze on her scarf. The 3rd mile, she hit a section where the snow had drifted deep and loose. She broke through with every step sinking to her thighs. The sled caught and overturned. She had to unload it, carry each basket forward 20 feet, return for the next repeat. It took an hour to cover a 1/4 mile. By the 4th mile, her body was screaming. Her shoulders ached from the pack. Her arms trembled from carrying the basket. Her legs felt like they were moving through thick mud, but she continued. 1 step, another step. Forward progress measured in feet rather than miles. At the 5-mile mark, she stopped to rest. She sat on the basket for 10 minutes, eating a raw carrot and drinking snow she had melted in her mouth. The cold was numbing her face despite the scarf. Her fingers inside her gloves had lost feeling an hour ago. 3 more miles. She could see the town now. Not clearly, but the dark shapes of buildings against the white landscape. Smoke rising thin and gray from a handful of chimneys. She stood, lifted her burdens, continued. The 6th and 7th miles blurred together. Pain, cold, exhaustion. The mindless repetition of putting one foot in front of the other. The baskets growing heavier with each step, even though their weight had not changed. At one point she fell and could not immediately get back up. She lay in the snow for a full minute, her body refusing to obey her will. Then she thought about the children in town, about the elderly, about people dying from malnutrition while she carried fresh vegetables. She got up. The 8th mile was the longest of her life. Every step was a battle. Her vision had narrowed to the ground immediately in front of her. She could no longer feel her feet. Her hands were useless claws inside her gloves, but she could see individual buildings now. The church, the general store, houses with smoke rising from chimneys. She stumbled forward. 50 more steps. 40. 30. People were emerging from buildings, staring. She could see their faces now. Shock. Disbelief. 20 steps. 10. Eleanor reached the edge of town, and her legs gave out. She collapsed into the snow, the baskets spilling around her. Fresh vegetables rolled across the white ground. Green kale, orange carrots, brown potatoes. Impossible things. Miracle things. People ran toward her. She heard voices but could not make out words. Hands lifted her. Someone was crying. Henrik Larsson's face appeared above her, his expression stunned. Ash barked, jumping around her, licking her frozen face. Eleanor, you're alive. You're actually alive. She tried to speak, but her jaw was too frozen. She could only nod. Then another face. Silas. Her brother's expression showed something she had never seen there before. Shame. Absolute crushing shame. "What have I done?" he whispered. "Eleanor, what have I done?" Dr. Morrison was there checking her for frostbite, wrapping her in blankets that appeared from nowhere. "Get her inside," he commanded. "Now, before the cold takes her." They carried her into the nearest building, which happened to be the church. Someone had already started gathering the spilled vegetables, handling them like they were made of gold. Adelaide appeared, her face thin and drawn. She looked at Eleanor, then at the vegetables, then back at Eleanor. Tears streamed down her cheeks. "We laughed at you," she said, her voice breaking. "We called you a fool, and you came to save us anyway." Eleanor finally managed to speak her words, slow and slurred from the cold. "Father was right. The earth keeps its warmth. I just had to be patient enough to find it." The town gathered in the church as word spread. Eleanor Hayes had emerged from the ravine, alive, healthy, carrying fresh vegetables in the depths of the worst winter anyone could remember. It was impossible. It was miraculous. It was true. Dr. Morrison examined the vegetables with the careful attention of a scientist encountering something that should not exist. The kale was wilted from cold but still viable. The root vegetables were solid, firm, perfect. The nutritional value they represented was staggering. "This is fresh food," he said unnecessarily. His voice carried wonder. Fresh. In January. In Wyoming. People were crying. Families with children were begging for just one potato, one carrot, anything with real nutrients to stop the progression of scurvy. Eleanor, wrapped in blankets and slowly warming, directed the distribution. Children first, then the elderly, then the sick. The vegetables were divided with careful precision, ensuring the most vulnerable received what they needed most desperately. One potato, a handful of kale, a few carrots, portions that seemed small but which represented salvation to bodies failing from malnutrition. Silas stood at the back of the church watching. He had not approached Eleanor directly since that first moment. Shame kept him silent. But Eleanor saw him. Across the crowded room, her eyes met his, and she nodded. A small gesture of acknowledgement. Later that evening, when the initial chaos had settled and Eleanor had been fed hot soup and given dry clothes, Henrik brought her father's journal that she had asked him to retrieve from the cave during his next trip. "I will go tomorrow," he said quietly, "to check on your garden and bring back more supplies. But I thought you might want this now." Eleanor took the worn leather book with gentle hands. She opened it to the final entry, the letter to her. Then she stood slowly, her body still aching from the journey. She walked to the front of the church where people were still gathered, still marveling at the miracle of fresh vegetables in winter. "My father wrote this before he died," she said, her voice carrying in the quiet space. "I'd like to read it to you." She read the entire entry aloud. Every word of Robert Hayes's final message to his daughter. His explanation of why he had given her the cave. His belief in her qualities of patience, observation, and faith. When she finished, silence filled the church. Then Silas stepped forward. His face was wet with tears he made no effort to hide. "Father told me that ambition without wisdom is just greed," he said, his voice raw. "I didn't understand what he meant. I thought I was the wise one, the practical one, the one who saw the world clearly." He looked at Eleanor directly. "I was wrong. About everything. About the cave. About you. About what Father was trying to teach us." Adelaide joined him, standing beside her brother. "We mocked you," she said simply. "We laughed at Father's dying words. We treated his gift to you as worthless. And you saved us anyway." Nathaniel was there too, the youngest brother, his face showing the same shame and recognition. "You honored Father's faith when we dismissed it," he said quietly. "You believed when we doubted. You acted when we mocked." Eleanor looked at her 3 siblings, all of them older, all of them so certain of their superiority, all of them broken by winter's truth. "Father gave each of us what we could handle," she said gently. "You needed to learn humility. I needed to learn faith. Maybe we've all learned what we were supposed to." Dr. Morrison stepped forward, clearing his throat. "Miss Hayes, I must ask, how many vegetables do you have remaining at the cave? What you brought today has helped, truly helped. But it's not enough for the whole town through the rest of winter." Eleanor smiled slightly. I have more. The garden continues producing. I can harvest every few days. If someone helps me make the journey, I can bring more. The relief in the room was palpable. This was not a one-time miracle. This was sustainable, ongoing, a source of fresh food that would last until spring. Over the following weeks, Eleanor made the journey between cave and town 5 more times each time with Henrik's help, and Ash trotting alongside. They established a route, built cairns to mark the way, created a system for transporting the vegetables safely. The town began to recover. The scurvy halted. Color returned to faces. Strength returned to bodies. Children stopped dying. Silas spent his days helping Eleanor expand the cave garden, learning from her the techniques their father had documented. He worked in silence, mostly the physical labor a form of penance. Adelaide learned the cultivation methods, taking careful notes, asking Eleanor to teach her everything their father had discovered. The knowledge became something they shared. A bridge rebuilt from ruins. Nathaniel constructed better access to the cave-building rope systems and wooden platforms that made the journey safer. His strength was useful. His humility was new. By March, when the first signs of thaw appeared, the town had survived. Not everyone. The weak had still died. But far fewer than would have without Eleanor's intervention. Dr. Morrison published his report in the Territorial Journal on the survival properties of geothermal agriculture in extreme winter conditions. The article brought attention from across the territory and beyond. A university botanist requested permission to visit and document the cave garden. The cave was officially named Hayes Spring by the territorial government, a recognition of what Robert Hayes had discovered and what Eleanor Hayes had proven. On a mild afternoon in late April, Eleanor stood at the cave entrance with her 3 siblings. They had come together for the first time since their father's funeral, but this time there was no mockery, no dismissal, no certainty that masked ignorance. Silas spoke first. I spent my whole life thinking I was smarter than Father, that I understood the world better than him. The cave proved how wrong I was. Adelaide nodded. He gave us each what we deserved. I got money because that's all I valued. You got knowledge because you valued learning. Nathaniel looked at the thriving garden beds visible in the lamplight. What do we do now? How do we make this right? Eleanor considered the question. Then she retrieved her father's journal and opened it to a blank page near the end. She began writing. We document everything, every technique, every observation, every bit of knowledge Father accumulated and everything I've added. We make it available to anyone who needs it. We turn this legacy into something that helps more than just us. She looked at her siblings, That's what Father would want. Not vindication, not proof, but knowledge shared. Wisdom passed forward. They stayed in the cave until sunset. All 4 Hayes children together learning from each other for the first time. Learning what their father had tried to teach them through the strange and perfect gift of an inheritance that seemed worthless until it saved lives. That evening, as Eleanor walked back toward town with her siblings, Ash trotting happily at her side, she paused at the ravine edge and looked back at the cave entrance below. The warm earth that had kept its heat through winter's worst. The sanctuary that had proven faith could be practical. and wisdom could be measured in harvested vegetables. Her father's words came back to her one final time. The earth keeps its warmth for those patient enough to find it. She had found it. She had used it. She had shared it. And in doing so, she had transformed a dying man's final gift into a legacy that would outlast them all. The spring sun was warm on her face as she turned toward home, toward family, toward the future that her father's faith had made possible.